Thomas Delaney was a 40-year-old FBI agent with nearly 2 decades of experience under his belt. Known for his sharp intellect, careful attention to detail, and calm, calculating demeanor, he had become one of the most trusted agents within the Bureau. His reputation as a no-nonsense, reliable professional had served him well, and his career was on an upward trajectory. He had sacrificed personal time, friendships, and many of life's pleasures to climb the ranks of the FBI. To the outside world, Thomas seemed like an ideal family man. He had been married to his wife, Helen, for 15 years, and their relationship was often the envy of their social circles. They had a beautiful home and 2 children, and were often seen at charity events and family gatherings, looking like the perfect couple. Helen, too, was a well-educated woman, independent, and successful in her own right. However, behind the polished facade, Thomas had started to wrestle with an inner conflict that would soon spiral out of control. He had met Sarah Price, a bright, ambitious, and strikingly beautiful young woman, in the FBI office. Sarah had joined as an administrative assistant, but her work ethic and eagerness quickly caught the eye of her superiors, especially Thomas. Though their professional interactions initially seemed harmless, it didn't take long for the two to begin a secretive, passionate affair. Sarah was in her early 20s when she started working closely with Thomas. She was everything he wanted: youthful, attractive, and driven. Sarah had just moved to Washington, D.C., with dreams of carving out a career in public service. She admired Thomas not only for his accomplishments within the FBI, but for the aura of power and experience that surrounded him. Their affair began with stolen glances, casual conversations, and before long, a complete emotional and physical entanglement. For Thomas, the affair with Sarah became an escape from his increasingly strained marriage. His bond with Helen had begun to fray. The long hours at work, the late-night phone calls, and his growing sense of dissatisfaction with domestic life made the allure of the young secretary irresistible. As their secret relationship deepened, so did the risk, and yet they both pressed forward, intoxicated by the thrill of their illicit encounters. Helen Delaney, despite her own successes, had always placed her family first. She had supported Thomas's ambitions unconditionally, knowing the sacrifices he made for his career. They had started their life together as a team, and for a time, they were deeply in love. Helen and Thomas built a life that many would consider ideal. But the cracks began to show when Thomas's behavior started to change. At first, Helen dismissed her growing concerns as stress from his demanding job. But as the months wore on, she couldn't ignore the late nights, the secretive phone calls, and the strange behavior. It started with subtle things: Thomas becoming distant, growing impatient, and the increasing time he spent at work. Helen, a woman of sharp intellect, soon began to suspect that her husband was hiding something. She confronted him several times, only to be met with reassurances and half-hearted excuses. But her intuition told her something wasn't right. It was during one of their quieter moments together that Helen first became aware of Sarah Price. She had overheard a conversation between Thomas and another colleague, and the way he spoke of Sarah, a subtle tone of reverence mixed with admiration, set off alarm bells in her mind. Despite her suspicions, Helen remained in denial, unwilling to believe that the man she loved and trusted could betray her. But the signs grew more evident. Late one night, after Thomas had left for work, she went through his things, an act she would later regret. but which she felt was necessary for closure. That's when she found the texts. The messages were undeniable, flirtatious, intimate, and filled with promises of love and escape. She couldn't believe what she was reading, but the evidence was right there in front of her. The perfect life she had built with Thomas had crumbled. The betrayal was no longer a suspicion. It was a painful, undeniable truth. As for Sarah Price, who had moved to Washington, D.C. with high hopes of making a difference, she had worked hard to climb the ladder, and her role at the FBI was an exciting step toward achieving her dreams. When she was introduced to Thomas, she was in awe of his authority, experience, and accomplishments within the Bureau. But her respect for him quickly evolved into something more complicated. The initial interactions between Sarah and Thomas were professional, but as they spent more time together, their connection deepened. He would often confide in her about his frustrations with work, his marriage, and his longing for something more fulfilling. Sarah, eager to please, began to take on a more personal role in his life, often meeting him after hours to share meals or drinks. At first, Sarah believed that their relationship was just a harmless fling, an escape from the pressures of their respective lives. But over time, her feelings for Thomas became far more profound. She convinced herself that their connection was special, and that one day they could be together, free of secrets and lies. She had no idea how close they were to a breaking point. For Sarah, the affair was a whirlwind, but as she became more emotionally invested, the toll it took on her became more evident. She began to pressure Thomas for more time, more affection, more commitment. But Thomas, though he cared for her in his own way, was unwilling to risk everything for their relationship. His career, his reputation, and his marriage to Helen were still more important to him. Despite his growing affection for Sarah, he continually brushed off her demands for something more. The affair between Thomas and Sarah had been going on for over 2 years by the time Helen discovered it. During that time, they had become experts at hiding their tracks. They exchanged cryptic messages, met in out-of-the-way places, and kept their relationship confined to stolen moments. They took every precaution to ensure that no one would uncover the truth. But the weight of the deception began to take a toll. As the affair continued, the secrecy weighed heavily on Sarah. She wanted more. She wanted to be more than just a secret lover. She pushed Thomas harder, demanding to know when their relationship could be more than just an affair. But Thomas, despite his growing affection for her, always kept her at arm's length. He was too cautious, too afraid of losing everything. Meanwhile, Helen, increasingly suspicious, began to track her husband's movements, watching as he became more distant and secretive. The moment Helen found the incriminating text on Thomas's phone marked the point of no return. She had confirmation, and now there was no turning back. What followed was a period of intense emotional turmoil for Helen. After the discovery of the affair set into motion a chain of events that would culminate in a tragic and irreversible act of violence. It wasn't just the affair that drove her to murder. It was the depth of the betrayal, the heartbreak, and the realization that her life had been a lie. Her mind, clouded with anger and hurt, concocted a plan for revenge. On the night of the murder, Thomas was late returning home, as he often was after meeting Sarah. Helen, still in a state of disbelief, waited for him in their living room, quietly stewing in the venom of betrayal. When he walked through the door, he immediately sensed something was wrong. But before he could speak, Helen simply looked at him, her face an unreadable mask. She asked him about his relationship with his secretary. He tried to explain himself, to justify his actions, but it was too late for words. Helen wasn't listening. She wasn't ready to listen to his lies and empty promises of change and his assurances that nothing meant anything. In a moment of sheer rage, Helen grabbed a firearm from the cabinet. She aimed it at Thomas, who stood there, shocked and unable to react. The shot rang out, loud, final, and unforgiving. Thomas fell to the floor, his body still in disbelief, even as it fell to the ground. His life ended in that instant. Helen stood over him, the weapon in her hand, her heart pounding, shocked by her actions. When the police arrived at the scene, they found Helen standing motionless beside the lifeless body of her husband. There was no sign of a struggle, no attempt to defend herself or flee. Just the cold, unnerving stillness of a woman who had taken justice into her own hands. The house was eerily quiet, the air thick with the weight of the crime. Helen made the call herself, reporting the murder with an unsettling calmness that immediately raised suspicion among the investigators. Her voice was steady, almost devoid of emotion, as she explained that she had shot Thomas in a fit of rage. But the lack of panic and the way she recounted the events with clinical precision baffled those who arrived on the scene. There was no frantic apology or tearful explanation, just an odd sense of finality. At first, the police considered the possibility of a crime of passion, an explosive outburst fueled by a sudden, overwhelming betrayal. But as they dug deeper into the investigation, a far more disturbing picture began to emerge. Evidence pointed to a carefully planned and premeditated crime. It was soon discovered that Helen had been tracking her husband's movements for weeks, if not longer. She had installed tracking software on his phone and kept detailed records of his interactions with Sarah. She had observed their secret meetings, noting the time and location of each encounter, and had even gone so far as to monitor his social media activity to confirm her suspicions. Each piece of evidence painted a picture of a woman obsessed with her husband's infidelity, one who had been stewing in her anger and resentment for months. In addition to the physical evidence, police uncovered Helen's journals. In them, she had written about her growing sense of betrayal and humiliation. The journals were filled with graphic descriptions of her emotional state, her thoughts ranging from despair to violent fantasies of revenge. Helen had confided in a close friend, telling her in no uncertain terms that she was planning to confront Thomas and make him pay for his betrayal. The friend had advised her to talk things through with her husband, but Helen's mind was made up. She had meticulously mapped out her plan, choosing the perfect time and place for the confrontation. An evening when Thomas would be alone, and when she knew he would not expect her wrath. She even purchased the gun weeks in advance, hiding it in the drawer of her dresser, waiting for the right moment to strike. Helen, the seemingly perfect wife and mother, had turned into a killer, a woman driven to murder by the toxic combination of betrayal, jealousy, and heartbreak. Some saw her as a victim of an unfaithful husband who had shattered her world, while others viewed her as a cold-blooded murderer who had taken matters into her own hands without any regard for the consequences. The media coverage was relentless, with every detail of Helen's personal life, including the history of her marriage and the affair, being exposed for all to see. Public opinion was divided. Some sympathized with her, believing that the pain of being betrayed by the man she loved was enough to drive anyone to the edge. Others saw her as manipulative and calculating, a woman who had coldly executed her plan to take control of her fractured life, regardless of the human cost. As the trial approached, the nation's attention only grew more intense. Helen, once seen as a devoted wife and mother, now stood as a symbol of the dangers of unchecked emotional turmoil. Her actions were both tragic and terrifying, a reminder of how a single, unforgivable betrayal could unravel everything: a person's sanity, their marriage, and their moral compass. Would she be seen as a victim of circumstance, or as a woman who allowed her emotions to spiral into something monstrous? The world watched, awaiting the answer. As the investigation continued, the focus shifted to Sarah, the woman who had been the catalyst for the tragic chain of events. She was brought in for questioning, her emotions a mix of confusion and fear as she tried to make sense of the situation. The police, after thorough interrogation, ruled her out as a suspect in the murder. To Sarah, the affair had been a fleeting connection, one that she believed was hidden in the shadows of Thomas's marriage. She had never expected that it would come to this. Her life, too, was suddenly turned upside down. She had been blind to the depth of the resentment brewing within Helen, and the idea that it could end in such a violent, irreversible way left her stunned and shaken. As detectives pieced together the timeline of events, it became clear that the affair was merely the spark that ignited an underlying and simmering resentment that Helen had been harboring for years. Beneath the surface of their seemingly perfect marriage, there had been tension and unmet emotional needs. Thomas had become distant over time, and though Helen tried to ignore it, she couldn't help but notice the signs of his growing detachment. It was this slow unraveling of their relationship that had, in the end, led her to betray her moral compass. The affair had been the breaking point, but Helen's path to that point had been paved with years of dissatisfaction and emotional neglect. As the investigation drew to a close, Helen was arrested and charged with first-degree murder. Despite the overwhelming evidence against her, a part of the public could not help but feel sympathy for her. Some viewed her as a woman who had been pushed to the edge by a husband who had betrayed her trust and humiliated her in the worst possible way. They saw a woman who had been broken by the betrayal, a victim of a society that often ignored the emotional labor of women in marriages. But others saw her actions as cold, calculated, and inexcusable. To them, Helen was no different than any other murderer who had taken a life in a moment of calculated rage. The complexity of her emotions, grief, anger, and betrayal did little to soften the harsh reality of her crime. The trial became a dramatic spectacle, drawing crowds and media attention from around the country. The prosecution's case centered around Helen's emotional state, arguing that her actions had been premeditated, driven by the slow burn of betrayal rather than a sudden burst of passion. She was painted as a woman who had allowed her jealousy and rage to consume her, methodically planning and executing her husband's murder. The defense, however, argued that Helen had been emotionally unstable, that her mind had been clouded by the years of emotional neglect and the devastating discovery of her husband's affair. They suggested that, while her actions were tragic. They were the result of a mind pushed too far. As the jury deliberated, the tension in the courtroom was palpable. The case had stirred emotions on both sides, with Helen's fate hanging in the balance. Days passed before the jury returned with their verdict: guilty of second-degree murder. The courtroom erupted in whispers, some in disbelief, others with a sense of grim justice. The jury had decided that Helen's actions, while deliberate, had not been premeditated to the degree that warranted the death penalty or a charge of first-degree murder. On the other hand, Helen's defense team painted a different picture. They argued that she had been pushed to the edge by the crushing weight of her husband's betrayal. Her lawyer contended that the affair had shattered her sense of self-worth and destroyed the trust she once had in Thomas. Overcome by grief and emotional turmoil, Helen had snapped in a moment of uncontrollable rage. Her defense team presented evidence of her deteriorating mental health, sleepless nights, escalating depression, and feelings of utter hopelessness as she grappled with the discovery of the affair. They painted Helen as a woman who had been systematically destroyed by the man she had once loved and trusted, a woman who had finally lost her grip on reality. Despite the defense's emotional argument, the evidence of premeditation remained overwhelming. The prosecution seized upon Helen's journals, where she had written extensively about her growing anger, sense of betrayal, and the gradual plan she had developed to confront Thomas. They also pointed to the murder weapon, which had been purchased weeks in advance, reinforcing their case that Helen had not acted in a fit of passion, but had methodically planned the crime. Her actions, the prosecution argued, were not those of a woman driven to madness by emotional devastation, but of a calculated individual who had decided to take justice into her own hands. For weeks, the courtroom drama captivated the public's attention. Opinions were divided. Some viewed Helen as a victim of a cruel betrayal, a woman who had been broken by the very man she had trusted with her life. Others argued that she had let her emotions spiral out of control, becoming consumed by anger and jealousy. As the trial progressed, a new question began to emerge. Could the nature of Thomas's affair with Sarah have played a more significant role in Helen's actions? Some began to speculate that it wasn't just the affair itself, but the emotional abuse Helen had suffered over the years that had left her vulnerable to snapping. Was Thomas's infidelity the breaking point? Or had there been deeper, unresolved issues within the marriage that Helen had never been able to confront? After days of deliberation, the jury returned with their verdict: guilty of second-degree murder. The court acknowledged the emotional toll of Helen's betrayal, but they also recognized the severity of her actions. While the jury accepted that Helen's emotional state played a significant role in the crime, they ultimately concluded that her actions were not impulsive or unprovoked. They sentenced her to 25 years in prison with the possibility of parole after 15 years. The verdict was met with mixed reactions from the public. Some felt that Helen had been a victim of circumstances, a woman pushed to her breaking point by a man who had betrayed her in the most intimate way possible. Others believed that the justice system had been lenient, feeling that Helen's crime could not be excused, no matter the emotional turmoil she had endured. In the end, Helen's story remained a tragic, complicated tale of love, betrayal, and the dangerous consequences of letting resentment fester in the shadows of a marriage. Helen's time in prison was marked by deep self-reflection and regret over her actions. She often wondered if things could have been different had she confronted Thomas about the affair without resorting to violence. Though she recognized that nothing could bring him back and that her actions were unforgivable, she tried to reconcile with her children, who had been placed in the care of relatives after her arrest. Her son, now a teenager, resented her, and her young daughter struggled to understand the tragedy. Helen wrote letters to them, expressing her sorrow and explaining her pain, but the damage was done. In prison, Helen became more introspective, turning to art and writing to process her emotions. She also became involved in prison outreach, helping women with similar emotional struggles. Despite never fully forgiving herself, she tried to find meaning in her new life. Though eligible for parole after 15 years, Helen chose to serve her full sentence, feeling she didn't deserve freedom given the consequences of her actions and the deep pain her actions had caused her children and the people who once loved her. The weight of her choices continued to shape her existence, and she could not escape the reality of what she had done. She saw herself as a cautionary tale, a woman driven to extremes by betrayal and hurt, unable to reclaim the life she had lost. Meanwhile, the case of Thomas, Helen, and Sarah continued to haunt the public, raising unanswered questions. How could Helen, a seemingly composed woman, let her emotions lead to murder? Was the affair a symptom of deeper marital issues? And what role did Sarah play in the tragedy? The public debated these questions for years, wondering if there could have been another way to resolve the situation without violence, and whether Thomas would have left Helen for Sarah.